Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the second event in the series Land, Life, and Liberation, Part 2. My name is Sally Frater, and I am the Curator of Contemporary Art at the Art Gallery of Guelph. I'm going to begin our time together today with the Art Gallery of Guelph's Land Acknowledgement. Today, Guelph is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from across Turtle Island. As we gather together, we would like to acknowledge that the Art Gallery of Guelph resides on the ancestral lands of the Attawandaron people, and more recently, these treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We recognize the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant to this land and offer respect to our Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis neighbors as we strive to strengthen our relationships with them. We express our gratitude for sharing these lands for our mutual benefit. Although we are convening virtually and might be individually located in different places, it is useful for all of us to remember that wherever we are, whenever we are in what we currently refer to as the Americas, we are on Indigenous land, and we should move forward in a spirit of mindfulness and reciprocity. I'll just do a quick note, and this is going to come up in the conversations today. We are going to be touching on issues of sovereignty and the Art Gallery of Guelph. This is something that we are thinking of, and we are looking towards, or we are looking to have a sovereignty statement that we're going to start issuing in the future. So I'm really looking forward to today's conversation because I think it will give us a lot of useful information that will help us to inform us in those areas. So before we begin, there are some brief housekeeping notes. Since we are in Zoom webinar, everyone's microphones are turned off, and you are welcome to submit questions throughout the conversation using the chat function. And when the conversation sort of comes to a close, then we'll address them at that time. And I would like to thank Jenna Brownlow and Shauna McCabe for their technical support for this series. Land, Life, and Liberation is a series of 5 conversations that will unfold as an accompaniment to the Decolonize This Place exhibition, When We Breathe Together, which is currently on exhibit at the Art Gallery of Guelph until April 25th. The installation and conversations center the Decolonial Operations Manual, which can be downloaded on the websites of Decolonize This Place and the Art Gallery of Guelph as a starting point for reflection and action. The Decolonial Operations Manual embodies the principle of movement-generated media and is a document offered as a tool of study, reflection, and action. The manual is grounded in 5 years of collective thinking, art making, and organizing undertaken by Decolonize This Place with dozens of groups in New York City and beyond, with numerous references to movement work preceding the establishment of Decolonize This Place in 2016. The scale, material, quantity, and distribution form of the manual underscores the importance of freely shared printed matter in the work of movement building. The conversations are about individuals thinking together about decolonization, abolition, and anti-imperialism in our movements. So today, along with Decolonize This Place and the MTL Collective, we have Anne Spice, Jess Kieran Dillon, Nelson Maldonado Torres, and Skylar Williams. Anne Spice Plinkett is a scholar and activist and is involved in the Wet'suwet'en anti-pipeline struggle, which brought rail travel in Canada to a standstill and introduced the fight against Coastal GasLink to the broader public. Jess Kieran Dillon is an anti-colonial scholar and organizer. She is the author of Prairie Rising, Indigenous Youth, Decolonization, and Politics of Intervention, which was published in 2017, and an editor of Standing with Standing Rock, Voices from the #NoDAPL movement from 2019 with Nick Estes. Nelson Maldonado Torres is a scholar, activist, and author of Against War, Views from the Underside of Modernity, which is published by Duke University Press in 2008, and Les Descolonización y el Giro Descolonial, which was published in Chiapas, Mexico, Editorial de la Universidad de la Tierra in 2011. Skylar Williams is a member of a Six Nations land reclamation camp and an iron worker. He is a spokesperson for the group's ongoing deoccupation of the Mackenzie Meadows development, dubbed 1492 Land Back Lane. This land reclamation has stretched on for months and has included blockades across area roads, court orders to remove people staying there, and dozens of arrests. The Six Nations says the property is unceded Indigenous land. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amin and Natasha.
Thank you, Sally, for that, and thank you, everybody at Guelph, for all the work that they've put in for this exhibition and also for these conversations. I just want to start by saying that I'm actually really excited to have this conversation, with specifically just Kieran, Nelson, Anne, and Skylar. This is the first time I meet Skylar, so I'm really excited to kind of build this new relation. And then with you all, we've been scheming together for such a long time, so it's kind of really nice to kind of do a check-in, considering so much that has happened since we kind of started organizing together. And so just an emphasis, I think some of the things that we're trying to, for ourselves, like as DTP, think about is, first, what does land back as a movement mean for both art institutions, for movements, but also, universities, and like, what is our relationship to it? And, how can we be in solidarity with it? And for it to not just be this land acknowledgement, right? We've all kind of, met around the time when land, especially in the United States, when even doing a land acknowledgement was a huge push to make, right? So now I think that the question around land back and institutions, that's a really important one that our movements are struggling with, specifically, when it comes to like trying to build solidarity across different lines, like decolonial, abolitionist, and anti-imperial lines, because quite often we're all working in our own issue silos, right? And then we're trying to figure out what does then solidarity mean between the abolitionist struggle, which, we've been part of through FTP, Whitney, and then the George Floyd moment, and then, decolonization, and specifically also anti-imperialism, like thinking about it from outside the Western context and thinking about what does solidarity means across borders. So kind of, and how is all of it rooted in action versus just thought, and the combination of those. So what are some of the actionable points that a movement can, both within the institutions and outside of that? And so we're hoping that, not that we'll have an answer about this in this conversation, but at least it's a beginning, or it's a starting of like furthering and deepening our thinking around action around these. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, and so from starting from the ground up and from people doing the work and from the land that we're kind of speaking on, we just want to give the floor to Skylar, and then Anne, and then just Kieran, and then Nelson, and 3 to 5 minutes, orient us about your thoughts and thinking. What do we need to have in the room, given what Natasha said and what Sally said, and then we'll just, facilitate a deeper conversation back and forth on this. So Skylar, take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just, welcome to 1492 Land Back Lane. And so right now I'm in one of the buildings that we were able to construct here on site, and that we've maintained now for, I think we're a few days shy of 8 months of our, what has been, except for the days when, of course, the police show up, peaceful occupations of our lands. I think that bit of that, and that solidarity, and that kind of kinship that is made between the struggles around the abolition movement and the defund the police and all that kind of stuff, really, trust me, the Indigenous folks certainly here from Six Nations understand what that means to be over incarcerated to, beyond belief. You can talk about the prisons and having 25% of the population of prisons be Indigenous folks, when we make up 3% of the overall population of Canada. You go to the women's prisons and you're talking about 30 to 33% a third of every woman that's in these prisons is Indigenous, you know, and so I mean, I think there's lots of parallels that can be made when we talk about the massive divides that happen in courts. And we tried our very best this past fall to argue against the injunction here at Land Back Lane, only to have me represent myself in the court and then be barred from my participation in that proceeding. The court then made a decision that the land claim that we had made over the lands here, decided that a permanent injunction would be in place, deciding forever that without hearing a bit of argument from the other side as to whether or not these lands were ours. And so our folks over the last 8 months here at the kind of the land back crew has put together all of the history of the land here, as well as the last 30 years of this land claims process that has been happening. And so when we went to court, we tried to enlighten some folks on what that history was and where our claim to this land came from. We did make a very concerted effort to make sure that we were doing this in the very best way that we knew how. We had a ton of help, and I'm the sole named party in the injunction. But I mean, I'm quite lucky in my friends that I've got some just amazingly smart people around me to be able to put together the case that we did, as well as just a ton of community that came out to make sure that we were able to maintain our place on the land here. Because I mean, it doesn't matter what happens in the courts if all of the land here is covered in concrete and asphalt. Like there's not a whole lot of room for us. I think for us, it's been like I said earlier, it's been a peaceful occupation. Like these are our lands, and we are going to utilize these lands how we see fit. And so for us, that means several tiny homes and a couple of 16 by 24 bigger buildings that folks have been able to utilize. And so like this idea that we're these violent and all the rest. And so the OPP has done tried to do a job in making sure that conversation about our stance here is one of violence. And I think we keep saying over and over and over again, like there's never been a weapon here of any kind on site. Like we make sure that we do everything that we possibly can to make sure that people come here with a good mind and come and it is a dry camp. There's never drinking or drugs allowed on site. There's not and so we do everything that we can to make sure that the folks here are taken care of, and people got food and warm place to sleep, and so yeah. And before I forget, I just want to shout out to Guelph, because I mean, like, Guelph has been a huge bit of support, and I know I've got some people that are very close to me from Guelph, and I like they're lots and lots of good folks that have been doing lots to help us out here at Land Back Lane. So I hope that was short enough to get the conversation going about that anyways.
Thank you, Skylar. Anne?
Thanks, Amin. I'm so excited to join everybody for this conversation and to see all of your faces. I am like in the depths of dissertation writing, and so I've come back from the front lines. I was spent about 3 years out on Wet'suwet'en territory, and I'm now in Toronto, and I'm trying to sift through my own memory and experience of that particular struggle. So I really feel like I'm in it, and I'm in this work of translation and trying to figure out how I write something about what I've gone through and about that struggle and the people who I'm in relation with out there, that is useful, that spurs action, that isn't just speaking to the academy, and then I just got to get it done. So I'm sort of like been revisiting moments as I try to write stuff up, and I've been thinking a lot, especially in the last month or so, about the eviction of CGL from Wet'suwet'en territory, which is something that happened in January of 2020. And then the subsequent set of raids on Wet'suwet'en territory, the siege of Wet'suwet'en territory, which you know, I was involved in. I was arrested during that time, and which spurred on these you know, massive acts of solidarity across the continent, really, sort of most notably from our Mohawk relatives, who threw down in a huge way to stop rail traffic and highway traffic on their territories. And so I'm thinking about a couple of moments that I want to highlight from that time. I'm thinking about the time between the eviction and the raids, which was a return on that territory, Wet'suwet'en territory, to a space where there wasn't industry and police constantly coming in and out of the territory, other than by helicopter. I'm thinking about the changes we noticed in the land, the animals that came back during the time where the roads were shut down and the blockade was in operation, and how quickly we noticed that shift. How you know, we saw our animal relations respond to our attempts to protect the territory. I'm trying to dwell in that, partially because the raids themselves were like very traumatic. So I'm thinking about that moment, about a month out there where we had the roads blocked off, and the police and industry weren't able to come into the territory, and sort of how that helped us deepen the relations with the animals and other people that we were you know, sharing that space with at the time. So that's something I just want to like hold up. And the second moment is actually like right after I got out of jail and started to hear about all of the solidarity actions that were happening across the continent, and how powerful it was to know that people were putting themselves on the line in support of what was happening on Wet'suwet'en territory. And what I saw as a kind of repetition of that in all of the actions that happened after the murder of George Floyd, especially the forms of solidarity that we saw emerging in Minneapolis between Indigenous and Black people in Minneapolis, and how powerful those statements of solidarity are when it means putting yourself on the line, when it means standing up and making sure that it's known that we're not going to sit by and watch our relatives and friends get arrested and be hurt and be attacked by the police and by the state, and that those forms of solidarity, those forms of consequence really for the actions of the state and industry are so important. It was important to show that that's not only possible, but it's to be expected that if you attack one of our nations, that other people will respond. And I think this is especially important, as Skylar mentioned, in the aftermath of a lot of this, as people are winding their way through the court system, facing a whole bunch of bogus, trumped up charges that we don't allow them to be made examples of. And that also spurs on a response that deserves a response, and that will continue to build the relationships between these frontline sites, these sites of struggle, and continue to show up for each other. And so I think that's that's something I've been thinking about in both cases, that we take these actions. Sometimes they feel small, or they feel like they can't really address the enormity of all of the attacks we're experiencing, but they have all of these repercussions and all of these responses from not only the animals on the territories, but also other nations and other people who are with us in struggle. And so I think that for me, both of those moments really were really important, and important to hold on to, that these responses can be expected, and we can also take on that responsibility of showing up for each other and really making sure that they don't get away with that shit. So I'll pass it back to you, Amin.
Thank you. Thank you. Jaskiran?
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see everybody. Just echoes everyone's enthusiasm for being here and being able to be part of this conversation. I want to start by thanking Sally and everyone at the University of Guelph who helped to put this together, and then to Amin and Natasha and everyone at Decolonize This Place for your ongoing work, and for the invitation to be here in conversation with everyone. And to just say, I'm really excited to be able to listen to and learn from, and it's nice to meet you, Skylar and Nelson too. So just thanks for the opportunity. So I'm speaking to you today from Philadelphia in a community bookstore called Making Worlds that I have in the last year been helping to maintain and keep sort of running and going in the face of the pandemic. And being here in this bookstore has really made me think a great deal about pedagogy and praxis and political education. And so much of the incredible work that is happening in communities in Philadelphia, but also, back home on that part of Turtle Island by Indigenous land defenders and water defenders and people that are sort of, including myself at various times, actually doing the hard work of lifting up the political and historical and social and economic context of this moment. And I'm thinking hard these days about what it means to actually work in solidarity with people in a world that feels incredibly fractured, in a set of movements that can also have incredible, I think, can also do and replicate incredible harm, because we too are also part of the worlds that we're attempting to transform. So thinking about how we recenter, not just in a rhetorical way, but what it means to build relationships with one another and to be able to sustain those relationships through a kind of political struggle. What places like a community bookstore have to offer in those kinds of contexts. And I don't mean just like a bookstore where people come in to read, but a social and political space and a community space where people come in and learn from one another, and are able to actually develop the kinds of relationships that allow for movement building to sustain itself over years and through various forms of adaptation that are required in the face of tremendous violence that is ongoing. I've also been thinking a lot about, and this is sort of a pandemic-induced set of reflections, given the isolation, the social and geographical isolation from some of my work that I've been doing in Cambodia for the last decade now, unable to actually move across the world to be able to think and develop and sustain relationships without doing it over a kind of Zoom interface, and thinking about the importance of internationalism. I find myself thinking that more and more every day about what that actually looks like. And so Natasha, I was excited to hear you also, echoing a similar kind of reflection. My parents grew up in Punjab. There's still land that my father has there, and there's immense farmers protests right on that land right now that are linked to many, many different things that I care about here in my home in Philadelphia, and then also, tied to so many of the struggles that I've been able to be part of and support: struggles for Native liberation, struggles for Indigenous sovereignty, struggles for abolition, struggles to support the Black communities in Philadelphia where I live that are completely under fire by the police, that have inherited an entire carceral history. It's a whole confluence of things that seem to be coming together in this moment. And I'm not sure if it's the fact that you know, we've been unable to be able to gather in the ways that we were able to gather before. And so there's a whole kind of accumulation of these questions and a sense of urgency that doesn't disappear, but actually gets greater every day. So yeah, those are some of the things that I sort of have been thinking hard about, how to actually spend my time. You know, I'm formally located in the academy, and I've always leveraged resources whenever I can. And as this sort of a primary relationship with the academy is my primary relationship is one of extraction. It's always about what I can draw from it to leverage out into the world, but really thinking hard about what my role in the university is relative, especially around teaching, relative to the kind of political education work that I feel like is essential in order for us to be able to build movements that reflect a kind of reciprocity, a kind of respect, and an integrity that will last in the face of the tremendous upheaval that we're facing across the world. And for me, it seems like absolutely crucial that we spend energy thinking about those things, and time in a good way, figuring out how to make those things come to life. So yeah, that's where I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Nelson?
Yes, well, it is really a pleasure to be here with you. Thanks to Decolonize This Place and to the University of Guelph and the library, everyone involved for organizing this. It's a real privilege for me to be here with all of you. Thank you for the invitation. And I am very pleased to meet new comrades, colleagues, partners in the struggle, and to see again Natasha, Amin, Amy, Mars, Crystal. Really a pleasure to see you all and reconnect again. I also want to shout out to Sheila Sandoval, who I believe is in the list of participants, of attendees, because her methodology of the oppressed, her text has been very fundamental for me for the last 20 years. And not only that, but it was actually in my mind as I read carefully the Decolonial Operations Manual. There is a conversation there between that text of almost 20 years ago, and the Decolonial Operation Manuals. And I look forward to keep engaging both, hopefully for the next 20 years and more. I also want to do a shout out to the comrades in the Black House Collective in South Africa. I see also that they are online. I'm going to mention a little bit of their work too. And as I read the manual, and actually I would say, let me start first to congratulate you for the manual and the exhibition. I wish that I was able to see the entire exhibition, but I am so thrilled having this manual, which is clearly a labor of commitment and love, and so very well done and very carefully thought out. And point number 4 of the Decolonial Operations Manual refers to the triangulation of struggles, which in the case of Decolonize This Place, they are mainly indigenous struggle, the indigenous struggle, Black liberation struggle, and the Free Palestine struggle. And as I thought about the point of triangulation, and I reflected back on my own work in the last decade or so, I kind of identified also triangulation of movements with which I have had the fortune of being connected. Each of which has its own triangulations, of course, and is very plural and rich. And one is the Puerto Rican decolonization movement, and also the Afro-Caribbean movement for emancipation and decolonization. But me as a Puerto Rican also particularly grounded on Puerto Rico and recognizing the colonial relationship between the US and the island of Puerto Rico. And particularly I've done this work in the last few years in conversation with organizations like the Colectiva Feminista en Construcción, which has its own triangulation with Black feminism and decolonial thought and decolonial feminism. And that's a decolonial formation, among others, that have been emerging in the island very strongly. Also in the spirit doing their own internationalism against border, which is the third point of the Decolonial Operations Manual. A second one has been the Third World Liberation Front, and this is coming from me being a faculty member at UC Berkeley in ethnic studies, And this was a department that emerged out of the Third World Liberation Front strike at San Francisco State University and UC Berkeley in 1969, 1968, and 1969. And that emerged out of a coalition of student movements, Black Student Union, Asian American Pacific Islander student movement, Chicano, Latinx, Latin American student movement, and also the Native American and Indigenous movement, which remains as a kind also of a prism for the kind of collaboration that one also finds reflected in the words of the manual. And of course, linked to that, there is the struggle of decolonizing the university. And I identify quite a bit with the words that Jaskier and Dylan just shared with us about this situation being at the university and how to use what elements and how to do it and how to educate new generations, not to use movements, not to extract movements for their own scholarship-based knowledge, but to leverage the resources in the university, mobilize them for the sake of decolonization and transformation. That remains a huge challenge. And so all of this I see connected to the Third World Liberation Front, but also can be connected to so many. One is the movement for the liberation of Azania or South Africa. And I've been fortunate to learn from and collaborate with the Black House Collective on the ground in South Africa, and with academics also engaged in the effort to, in their own words, decolonize the university. This is linked to the 2015 and 2016 movements of Rose Must Fall and Feast Must Fall, which fought and still continues to fight for the free decolonized university, which also involves the fight for having the land back. And South Africa, I want to keep it as very key in this dialogue, because it is a space where Blackness and indigeneity are not like in other places that they seem to be separate and one have to connect them. They are very much integral, because Black people are indigenous are Black people, land is to indigenous people, but also who have been colonized and rendered as Black. So the struggle against colonization, against anti-Black racism, and against anti-indigeneity are closely linked, along with attention to apartheid because of the history of the struggle, which connects with the Free Palestine struggle. So I find myself very, fortunate to learn so much from leaders, activists in these areas, and this is where I am positioned as I come to this conversation.
Thank you all. So that's what we're kind of bringing into the room. One of the conversations I had with Skylar just in the lead up to this was hearing a little bit more about like space and territory and the need for territory and the enclosure. And that made me think about the experience in Palestine. At least the land gets taken, people get squeezed into territory, and then there's nowhere. Your generations pass and there's nowhere to go. So perhaps, Skylar, back to you, give us a little bit more about like aside from the principle land back and the right and the treaties and the whatever, like what are the conditions on the ground that has led or sparked the desire to take action, and even the conversations among Six Nations, like what has this been like, and what are the reasons for it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a great question. I mean, so and I think that's something we talk about a bit, is over the last 150 years, it doesn't matter what town you live in, what city you're in, they've all had the opportunity to grow as communities, as cities. Like every one of them have grown exponentially over the last 150 years. The only communities in this country that have gotten smaller are reserves. Reserves have a booming population across the country, yet here we are, the only ones that have a restricted space in which we are allowed to grow. And so that forces us to grow in ways that are not traditionally ways that Indigenous people live in, and calling that covering everything in concrete and asphalt in the name of progress. That's not how how we live as Indigenous people, certainly not at Six Nations. And this is something that is true from just about every reserve that you go to, is that, like, if you look in Southern Ontario, there's one spot of green. You look down from the Google Earth there, you can see this one spot of green, of like dark green forest that is, you know, the virgin forests of Six Nations that have never been touched before by a plow or a saw. And it is the only spot in all of Southern Ontario that looks this way. And it is a very distinct square that you can see when you look from Google Earth at Six Nations. And so when you restrict any of that movement of growth, it means that we are going to be forced to grow in the very same way that our Western brothers and sisters have chosen to. And so that plowing everything under, and, you know, making sure that every bit of space is utilized to capitalize on, you know, to make money from, or whatever, like that forcing of the environment to benefit us in some kind of way, because, you know, we're not letting space for the deer and the foxes and the animals that grow and live around here. Like, this is for us as community, you know, we're a hunting community, you know, we you know, and I was just talking yesterday about going hunting for the first time, and what that meant to go hunt my first deer when I was, you know, a young teenager, you know, and what that process looked like. And so when we get hemmed in as a community by these massive developments here in Six Nations, like, remember, everybody needs to understand, like, this is Southern Ontario. You know, there's a quarter of the entire country lives in this area. And so when we're talking about the most lucrative bit of real estate that you can find anywhere up and down from coast to coast, it takes quite a bit, and there's a lot of pressure from government. There's a lot of pressure from police to make sure that Indigenous people are quiet when it comes to these issues. And so to occupy a space that was supposed to be home to 1,400 homes, that is going to further encroach on our lands, restricting us from being able to grow anywhere. Like, we can talk about the additions to reserve process, the ATR process that the federal government has put together, that has never worked for anybody, for any Indigenous community across the country. And so that process is one that is, you know, a nightmare for anybody to try and grow those lands, because the municipality that we're trying to grow into needs to be able to have has veto power over whether or not we grow. And there's no elected official that's going to be able to run for office next year if you know, they're choosing to have their tax base shrink.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, like Anne had kind of talked about that solidarity that we share amongst each other. And actually, was when I was arrested here on August 5th, I was also arrested for the solidarity blockade that we had done here, and blocked one of the major highways and railways that kind of came through our territory here at Six Nations, and was arrested for that as well. And I think that's one thing that people need to understand, that, like, all of our communities now are linked in ways that we've never been before. Certainly not since before contact, before all of these big divisions that, you know, because that's what the governments and the police, the RCMP before the OPP here in Six Nations have done over these last 100 and 150 years, while everybody else was growing and growing and growing their borders. They started to divide our communities and make sure that those reserves were places of isolation. And so now in 2020, 2021, now we see those relationships, those centuries and centuries year old ties that bound us, those treaty relationships that we have aren't something that is new for us. This wasn't an after contact that we started making treaties. We had, you know, those same treaty relationships that are still honored by communities across the country, by nations across this country. And so when Anne talks about that solidarity between our nations, like, that's something that we hold very, very close to our hearts. And so I think when, you know, you mess with one of us, you're gonna get the horns from all of us. So I mean, it's something that we really take to heart.
Mars, you said you had a question? Or no?
No, not right now.
Okay. Well, just to kind of follow up on that, Skylar, you know, one of the things that I think when we were talking, and then I think it's a conversation for everyone. So it's not, there's things that I heard from Skylar that I just want to bring into the room as well, and that for everyone to kind of think through. But like, what struck me about what you were describing is that logic being applied to the same place I came from in the same ways. And in fact, in Palestine, what they do, the Israeli government, it encloses you, and simultaneously you have nowhere to build, so you start building illegally. But the building illegally then is subject to a fine. And you also have to pay for the own destruction of the structures that you built illegally, or else you go to jail, or in addition, you go to jail. And I was just thinking about how, like, it's not so much for me, for my experience, it's not just so much that it's kind of like to separate you from progress and to make an example of you, but it's a slow burn of the continued eradication and genocide and taking of the land, but it's the slow burn that doesn't allow for people to say that's a genocide, or it's a genocide going on again. And so I was wondering, just like one last thought, in your internal conversations to do the encampment, to do the deoccupation, was it easy to have that conversation and say it's time to take direct action and it's time to kind of face internally, to face the kind of brunt of the system, trying to kind of, what was that conversation like? And I think the same goes for Anne, you know, thinking about that.
Yeah, I think, you know what, those conversations start at home for me. And those conversations start with my kids. And so that conversation with because I have 4 daughters that, you know, have seen dad go off to these, you know, their entire lives. And so there's always that conversation with them that, you know, like that, you know, cops have been known to, you know, arrest us, to shoot us, to hurt us in lots and lots and lots of ways. And so, you know, my youngest daughter cries and gives me a hug and tells me, you know, I love you. And, you know, I see my older daughters that have, you know, done, you know, organized school walkouts when they raided in Anne's community. My daughter came home from school and we were on the highway, and she got brought down, and she come and hung out with me, and she was like, well, what can I do? Like, what can I do, Dad? Like, how do I do something to make this known in my school? And so I said, well, you know, we started talking about what that would look like to do a walkout and organize a big school in our high school, because here in Caledonia, the staging area for the OPP, the provincial police here, is directly across the road from the high school. And so for our kids to, you know, have to walk out every day from school to see, you know, 100 OPP cars filling the parking lot of a school that, you know, that just arrested their mom, that you know, had shot at their dad just weeks before, you know, like these are the very real struggles that, you know, I think most of us try to think about and anticipate before these things happen. But I mean, when all of that, the weight of the criminalization of all of it is, it's really something that's hard to kind of fathom before. And so when, you know, in this particular one where we've seen highways and railways dug up with heavy machinery and roads, and, you know, like this, the weight of that criminalization of us is something that's really hard to try and anticipate for. And so it is, yeah, it's a bit of a hard conversation to have, kind of prior to this, because you never quite know what's going to happen or what that win looks like. And I think that's always a conversation for activists in general, is to have that hard conversation with yourself about what within community, within those circles of how what's the end game here, or like, is that something that is possible? And so yeah, for us, that those conversations certainly had to happen, and for us, I think it in this particular circumstance was just to say, you know what, we're not going until this land is ours.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And do you have anything to kind of share along these lines?
I definitely hear what Skylar is saying in terms of the criminalization and also what you're saying, I mean, about the strategy of containment. And I think that that's something that we really need to flag and look out for, because that is it's a common tactic that's used against Indigenous people. Is this, usually it's a slow containment, and in our case, it's often starts with a movement to the reservation, and then continuous redefining of all of our vast traditional territories in ways that mean that we can no longer access them. And so what's been happening on Wet'suwet'en territory is that, I mean, there are these territories that are defined as crown lands, even though there's been no treaty made with the crown. And then they get sort of like slowly used for other purposes. And so you have this space that's now defined as a construction site, where it used to be a hunting territory. And that's the sort of like slow encroachment that writes Indigenous people out of our own territories, and makes daily life and regular daily activities criminal, and adds an element of danger. And I think that's something that it's hard to really get across to people what that feels like, to be going out hunting and have police following you, or to know that you could run into police with semi-automatic weapons on a trail while berry picking. I think that sort of it's a kind of violence that's usually not visible because it's out in these spaces that you're not really seeing, and it eats away at the sense that you can just practice this alternative to a like fully colonized existence. And I think that's part of what we really are trying to push against, is that the only way we live free as Indigenous peoples, and I would expand that to say that this is like offering an alternative way of living to more than just Indigenous peoples, is if we're able to be on our lands and to hunt and gather foods and gather medicines, and actually sort of disentangle ourselves from the ways that we've become dependent on the state, because that was a tactic of genocide, is to make us dependent on the state and to say we can't exist without all of these structures that are in place. And that's why these conversations, community conversations, are difficult, is because people have been forced into poverty, have been forced off of their territories through generations of erasure and elimination. And any attempts that we have to kind of claw back some of what we've lost are met with police and guns. And so that's why it is a risk. It's a risk to put ourselves out on the land, and it's difficult to ask people to do that in community, because like land defense is so criminalized, and things that shouldn't feel wrong and shouldn't feel criminal, you end up you're getting surveillance, and there's helicopters, and you're like, I'm just picking berries, like this shouldn't be something that I'm feeling like scared about, but that's what they're trying to do to us, is to make us a space where we only can relax and avoid those forms of criminalization when we're like in the little boxes that they've put us in. And I really want to honor the work that Frida Hewson and other Wet'suwet'en folks have done over really decades in community, that this is, when we see these sort of these occupations and we see the blockade and we see the raids, like that's the strength and the courage to do that is built on years and years and years of very careful community work to get everyone on the same page, to talk to people about the importance of standing up to these companies, to try and provide alternatives to, you know, the benefits agreements and the little scraps of money that the companies are offering to come through the lands. And it's hard work. It's like really hard work, and it sometimes feels like thankless work. And you know, I think that the people, I mean, Frida especially, but other people who've been standing up on that territory really deserve a lot of respect, and we need to hold them up, because I mean, they're tired from years and years of that, and it's not always easy to get your community on board when it requires sometimes like quite a serious sacrifice and a serious risk to just be able to like assert that the land belongs, you know, not to the state, that this is a space that you should be able to have access to and to protect. So I think there's definitely a history there. I'm so livid when I read things that are talking about how, you know, the Wet'suwet'en nation is divided. I mean, it's this divide and conquer tactic that's like age old, making it look like, you know, people are just at each other's throats all the time, when really it's like people trying to strategize how to survive, and trying to, you know, keep each other alive in situations where you're constantly under attack. And you know, sort of jumping on those little bits of division, I think is just so irresponsible, because you know, what we've seen, I think over the last, you know, couple of years is a really remarkable amount of solidarity, both within that nation and within, you know, all of our nations, as Skylar was talking about. And that's where we should be putting our focus, is that that's possible despite all of these attacks and attempts to divide us. We're still standing up for each other. And those of us who have access to more privilege and who are, you know, have a bit of a safety net when we put ourselves in these situations, I think it's, you know, we have a responsibility to step up for others in our communities who aren't able to do the same.
One of the things that I think, and this is also for everyone, and also for Nelson and just Kieran, because the international element, or the experiences that are happening across the world right now, things that we're related to, can inform us a lot about how to move and what are the challenges that we have ahead. And I think that's where the manual was coming from. And to give you an example, these colonial tactics that I'm familiar with, like the black goat was rendered like illegal by Israel, because this is in the 50s, because they said, oh, it's a very precious thing. So they made it illegal, but that's what the shepherds had. The taking of the land, at least in the context of Palestine, was the taking away of being able to survive on your own. So then it produces this dependency on the state, which leads me to this question, which is something that I think everyone's thinking about. How do we decouple nations from states? Because what's happening is that this is not just becoming an indigenous issue, or in the context of Palestine or Palestinians, the new generation isn't thinking of state as synonymous with self-determination, right? So it's forcing us to think about the political imaginaries that we can articulate through struggle. South Africa is a reoccurring one because it has the complexity there. But I think in Punjab, you're dealing with a similar thing. You know, is the coming at this from like, oh, well, Punjab as a sovereign state or Palestine as a sovereign state, what does that do in terms of like our desire to get free? In the context of New York, the challenges that we see for our movements, and just to bring it, because I think we would love to hear people's thoughts on it, we're having a lot of issues. The role of the artist seems to be one of art. The role of the educator is one of education within an institution. The role of like the gentrification struggle is one that has to relate to, you know, displacement. So then you have to force the issue of long-term displacement in the conversation. You talk about the United States and then everyone's talking about how to get free, but you're saying, well, it's also an empire. So how can you explain the Ethiopian soldier who's shooting Palestinian kids in occupied Palestine? The complexities of what's being raised, which is already being said, is like the confluence of all these struggles are coming together with such intensification that we can't, like, we're having difficulty just upholding one without saying, well, why aren't we talking about all of this? And how do we move together? And towards what? And how do people retain their own thing as we figure it out? And what are the debts that we owe each other that we need to meet now in terms of solidarity? And on what principle? And I think that that's kind of what I want to bring to this room. That is all you've already laid the foundation for. So Anne, you know, Nelson.
Can I add to that?
Can I add?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. You go, Nick.
Go ahead, Mars. You could go.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. Everything, like +1 to everything Amin just said, but especially when some of the current goals of our movements or the futures that we're orienting ourselves towards are at odds with other struggles that we wish to stand in solidarity with, right? So like thinking through historically how Black liberation and how like reparations and how people are still fighting for 40 acres and a mule on stolen indigenous land. Like, what does that look like? But we're naming that, we're finding these connections between Black and indigenous struggles through incarceration, policing, histories of colonialism. We're showing up for each other's in the streets. You know, if you call on action, especially in New York over the past, we've noticed like a shift over the past probably 5 to 10 years of folks really just being like showing up for anything, whether it was what's happening in the Amazon, whether it was George Floyd or all these different things. And then we're there and the energy is there, but then we're at odds with each other when we think of how do we move together and how do we move towards some sort of future. There's issues around, you know, sovereignty, slavery, the settler indigenous binary that settler colonial studies sets up fails us constantly. There, you know, where does that place a lot of people when you think of histories of displacement and dispossession over time? Where does that leave different folks? And so that's what I would love to hear from you guys about, because it's something I'm stuck on. Something that Ben said last 2 weeks ago conversation is that this can only happen through struggle. And so I'm wondering how and what does that struggle look like, and how do we grow it together?
I don't know if I should add or we should let people go. I feel like, is it too much? No, should I just go? Okay. Well, I think mine just to add to it, I think Skylar brought up, like, you know, the idea of violence and that, you know, you all are involved in a peaceful deoccupation. And I just wanted to add that to the mix also, and how violence is often weaponized both by the state, and then that gets weaponized on us as well. And I feel like that's what's happening. Like, for example, just kidding, I'm in Delhi right now, and I've been in Punjab. And so, you know, like just being, you know, in terms of what the farmers are doing, very specifically, it's, you know, it's expanded form of land back, right? Because it's like, you know, we don't want land to go to corporations. But what that does is that specifically because, you know, it was first initially started by Sikhs, and there's like a historical label of terrorism on you know, basically sovereignty in Punjab. And what the history of the movement there has been is that you see that tag kind of come along even with this movement, which is around farmers, right? So the violence that is there by, you know, both by the, and then this kind of constant emphasis on our part to say this is a peaceful deoccupation, right? That's where a lot of the energy then ends up going, right? And then I feel like that also kind of produces this kind of energy of harm both ways, right? Because a lot of times what we've seen is that divides our communities, which is what you were talking about, Anne, right? Like, we actually, there is a divide that then starts becoming, which is about either assimilation into the system, which is saying that you're violent, and then therefore, you know, you're basically trying to prove you're not, or like, you know, you then considered a radical and like an outcast, right? And then you like, you know, be it around media or be it around movements or be it around anything, there's a whole other kind of a struggle that you're fighting with, right? And so then that produces that. And I feel like that, you know, you just mentioned a little bit about it, like in terms of the accumulation of harm, which then is, you know, then exists, but also the transformation and the reorientation that is required even within movement building. So just that as a question. And then Nelson, like you've written a lot about aesthetics and the role of aesthetics. And I think since we're having this kind of art and movement building conversation, if you could add a little bit about, you know, what aesthetics also mean in kind of our movement world, specifically within decolonization, abolition, and anti-imperialism, I think that would be good. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to jump in, and I'll try to be brief-ish because I want to hear from other people as well. Maybe just to address your point, Natasha, about violence, I think in the end, it doesn't matter if we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that we are perceived as peaceful. And in the end, that doesn't actually matter in terms of what kinds of violence we experience. When they came in to raid Wet'suwet'en territories, they had snipers pointed at us. They knew that we weren't armed. And in the end, they were like, well, we know that there were hunting rifles around, and so that's why we needed to check you out with the scope of our snipers. So like in the end, it doesn't matter. They're going to use their violent tactics either way. I think we're probably a little bit less likely to get shot if we're not actually holding a rifle. But I think that something's happened in the way that these movements have developed. And I think about this a lot as I also revisit materials from my late friend and mentor, Brian Granboy. You know, he was part of blockades going back decades in Red Power movement, American Indian movement, and they were always armed in those spaces. And something happened in the sort of public consciousness that put Indigenous people in a position where we're not allowed to defend our territories with those tactics. Otherwise, we're written off as sort of violent radicals or terrorists. So something happened there, and I'm interested in what that shift is and what the sort of array of tactics are that are acceptable now. And they really require Indigenous people to take a huge amount of abuse and violence without ever pushing back. And even the small ways we do push back are immediately sort of cast as criminal. And so it's a really difficult line to walk. And I think that's one of the places where, you know, we can use help in terms of public narrative work. You know, none of these things should be defined as terrorist or criminal. And so pushing back against that is something that can really help us. I think to Mars's questions there, I think that the question around how we form solidarity is when sometimes we're looking for different outcomes is so crucial in this moment, as part of the reason why I think, at least for me in my own thinking, I think the starting point is abolition. I think that some of the language that we've used in Indigenous movements can be exclusive and polarizing. And I think that some of it we need to let go if it's not serving the purposes of both our liberation and the liberation of Black people. I think that we need to look at where our struggles overlap in terms of who our common enemies are and which structures are we working against and need dismantling. And then that's where we put the energy. And I think that's why the language of abolition is helpful for me, because it's like, what do we need to actually take apart in order to move forward? I think when we talk about decolonization, a lot of people can, even though we tell them again and again and again that it's not a metaphor, like there's still a way that folks are holding on to these structures and think that they can do the work of decolonization while the structures remain intact. And the structures can't remain intact if we're going to get free. So if we think with the language of abolition first, I think we start to think like, all right, we're not going to get anywhere if we still have the fucking police. Like, let's get rid of them, you know? Abolish that, and then we can sort of move forward. So I think there's two things that are happening. One is like, how can we help each other, dismantle these things that are killing us? And then how can we like really work on stretching our imaginations to think about the world we want to live in on the other side of that? Like, what kind of relations do we want to have with each other? Who do we want to be welcoming onto our territories? And then how do we sort of build towards that? So I think sometimes we get stuck on the language of sovereignty. I think that can be a powerful move against a particular force. Like, I want to talk in terms of sovereignty when I'm speaking directly to the Canadian state, to be like, you don't have it, you don't have sovereignty like we do. But when I'm talking to other people who, you're right, aren't appropriately cast as in this sort of settler indigenous binary, then yeah, I don't want to talk about like how we're going to somehow have like supreme authority in the aftermath of all of this. I want to talk about how we build relations now, how we like all can work on being in better relation with the land. And that I think is, there's some work that we need to do within Indigenous movements to make sure that we're not imagining a future without our Black friends and comrades and relatives like on our territories. I think that's a huge mistake, is to sort of do this imagining and then sort of just like, who's going to be there with us? Like, obviously the people who are throwing down for us now. So like, let's build them in right now into sort of how we talk about other ways of governing and like relating to each other. And I think that, yeah, that's partially in digging deep into our personal relations as well, and thinking about how the framework of abolition helps us take that, the ways that we're relating out of the carceral. Like, we really still treat each other like we're treated by police. And, that's got to stop. We've got to find ways of relating to each other that aren't carceral, that aren't about, removing people and, policing them, and figuring out how do we actually live together in this space. I think is that imagination work that's really important. So yeah, I would rather, let go of some terms if they're not serving us, and really focus on like, who's our common enemy, where are they vulnerable, and where are we differently positioned to like really work to bring these structures down. And I think that all of the actions that were happening after the murder of George Floyd really sort of showed a little bit of that. And I think that, there were Indigenous people on the ground in Minneapolis and other spaces who really stepped up. And then I think there's a lot of others who, we were a little slow on the uptake to sort of figure out where we fit. And there were a lot of statements that came pretty late. I think you can say you're in solidarity, and that's fine, but we've got to do better than that. And I think for me, that's that focus on really bringing down these systems, and having the courage to say like, no, let's actually imagine a world without police here, and then how would we actually organize together to make that happen. I think that's been really important.
Yeah, I just want to jump in there too, and like that's and trying to frame what we're doing all the time is a constant conversation about how to frame ourselves as not being the terrorists. Like here in Caledonia, the mayor of Haldeman County has come out, over and over and over again to call us terrorists, and to, for defending our lands. And in the peaceful way that we have, we still manage to, try and control the narrative around what that looks like. But it's a constant thought for us around, how am I being portrayed? And so, that this idea that if we smile and we're nice, but if we're angry, then we're terrorists. If we're yelling and screaming and jumping up and down, then it changes what that narrative looks like. And so for us to have taken lots and lots and lots of time to, make sure that every time that we're speaking about whatever in this is that, reiterating that peaceful occupation of our lands, that this isn't an armed struggle. This isn't all of that. And, with solidarity stuff that folks have been doing, and bringing boots to the ground here, like that, like all of that is, crucially important to any of these movements. And, I think, a lot of the capacity stuff that, you know, people have, certainly now in the age of COVID stuff, like we really need to try and utilize the people that we have in the best ways that we can. Because if we're not bringing people together, like there's like, if we don't have people on the ground here, like all of the political moves that folks have been making to try and bring community together within Six Nations, and the outreach to the feds in their province, and, you know, select politicians within that, and the advocacy work that's going on there, like all of that work means nothing if you know, Haudenosaunee people aren't on the land here, you know. And so to make sure that we're doing all of the things, and, you know, have all of the wheels turning all the time, like it is that is a big part of this, is making sure that, you know, every facet of this is going along, but framing ourselves as in that peaceful light all the time is sometimes not always easy, because like there are things that politicians do, there are things that the cops do that are absolutely infuriating, and to try and keep that mode of peace and of you know, to hear the Haldeman County come out as calling us terrorists, and to, you know, have them prod along the OPP to continue to go after my family, you know. And my family, my parents are, you know, in their 70s. My kids are teenagers, you know. And like, this is something that the Haldeman County Police Services Board has advocated for since the beginning of this, is that the defining us as terrorists. Like it's absolutely ridiculous and infuriating.
Jaskira and Nelson, I think this is an area I would love also your thoughts.
Nelson, do you want to go first, or go for
Please
it?
do. I can.
Okay, I'll start quickly, and then you can just jump in.
Sure.
You know, make sure I leave time, you know, some space and time if there are additional questions folks want to raise too. Yeah, I just want to, you know, I think there's been so many wise things that have been said so far, and so much, I think, thoughtfulness and reflection. So I've really just been sitting here listening and thinking and absorbing all of that, and taking it in, and sort of thinking about how it resonates deeply with me, and I think are also some of the ways that I've been thinking about what it means to engage in a revolutionary movement for, you know, radical social transformation across the planet. And so I was also like thinking about some of the points that were raised about the sort of differentiation between the nation and the state. And I mean, I think that terminology and those frames are traps that are very easy to get caught in a whirlpool around. And so I feel like part of what I'm hearing people say too are like thinking through the ways that we, our histories are co-constituted, and as collectives with certain like commitments, responsibilities, and political goals, we would be better served by spending our time sort of understanding that co-constitution, and then figuring out places of alignment where we want to work together to be able to create the kind of world that we want to live in. Because the reality is that here is there and there is here. So you can be engaged in, you know, a movement for, you know, a specific kind of liberation struggle, a political struggle here, for example, on Turtle Island, but, you know, because of the way that our world is structured through global racial capitalism, we're intricately tied to what's happening in so many other parts of the world, not to mention US militarization and the presence of, the US military, Canadian mining corporations, peacekeeping troops that are part of the United Nations, right? The Security Council, Western state power, all of the ways in which the places that we live in here are tied to the places that we care about there. So like here and there feels like important to think of in terms of collective people power and shared political history, but also a set of political goals. I think it's challenging to think through what a set of political goals look like in the abstract. But if you start to think through the sort of the histories that you're struggling against and the institutional structures and the state formations and the formations of global capital that you're also fighting against, it becomes easier, I think, to articulate an agenda for freedom that is shared and has like points of connection and differences too that probably and will always exist, but there is a kind of shared commitment to moving forward. And I do think the stakes are incredibly high. And I also think that our movements need a great deal of work and time in thinking about how this is going to be possible.
Yeah, well, building on precisely these points, I think the case of well, first off, of the Americas generally, South America and so on, and Australia, where so many indigenous communities are facing, expropriation and extermination still. And that's certainly, so we're talking not only about is both local, but also a very global kind of issue. And it reflects itself and extends itself in different ways. For example, even in the case of Puerto Rico, where after Hurricane Maria and the devastation of Hurricane Maria, many people died, many people left the island to the US territories, and then and that opened a space then for private corporations, private entities in the territories of the US then buying property and buying land in the island. And that becoming another way, right? The crisis becoming another way of losing territory. Now you're in this is happening while you're living in a colonial condition, which means that even when you have the title to the land, that doesn't mean that that makes the people in there sovereign of that land, right? You are a kind of you have a title, but that doesn't necessarily translate into political sovereignty. That's a problem, just as it is a problem also the idea that you are just still buying land and therefore you are being kind of completely connected into the regime of private property, which points to the question of what are the other views of land and living in land and living with each other that we need to cultivate. So as to when we fight for decolonization or emancipation, we're not simply reproducing the terms that we are given, that we have been given, and these catastrophic terms that have led us to be disconnected from each other and disconnected from the environment and disconnected from life in the environment. And that is a formidable challenge, I think. In the island, you have seen, of course, movements that have sought to advance or cultivate sustainable forms of, of cultivation, of relating the land and with each other. But there is so much to learn from movements and peoples who have been dealing with this for centuries. We have, but there have been kind of, in some sectors, there have been a gap with, let's say, ancestral forms of connecting with the land. If we have in Puerto Rico, it has been mainly through the presence of the African diaspora in the island, right? And Afro-Puerto Ricans and Afro spirituality and art and aesthetics that have kept another kind of way of relating to each other and the land, but also disconnected from the rest of the Caribbean and other places. So we need to do a lot of work of maintaining that connection and reconnection. And let me also bring back the manual, because one thing that struck me about the manual, when the manual begins where we begin, and I think where we begin in the first part is recognizing precisely the condition of the kind of catastrophic fragmentation that exists. Coloniality creates this catastrophic fragmentation that makes it extremely difficult difficult to generate decolonization, because it means that you're not only separating yourself from the colonizer, is how do you then build a new kind of relationship with the colonized and with each other, and you form another reality. And again, when the main concepts that have been circulating around have been given most prominence, they have been complicit in the fragmentation in the first place: nation, state, and sovereignty, and all such concepts. So how do you employ those concepts critically and generate other concepts and other ideas? And I think that some of those ideas are already are echoed in the manual. For example, when in the manual you write that when we breathe together. What is that about breathing that might be so key when thinking of our common humanity, on of our vulnerable condition on Earth, and what it means to preserve our relations? When we walk, we do not run because we're going very far. That's also appears in the manual. That's also walking and thinking and weaving also are activities that have been central in many communities, in Abya Yala, completely about ways of cultivating forms and creating new forms of reality, and really having the coloniality emerge from this new practice of being together. And also it struck me, just to end with this, that in the first point, when we begin, all the kind of the main actions that appear in your first point of the manual are all about forms of relationality, starting with offering is one. It has to do with gift giving too. Standing with our relations is the second one that appears in text. Calling is also another way of connecting with others. And finally, taking responsibility to act. So right now it's clear that in order to begin any kind of movement, you have to begin to opposing this catastrophic fragmentation and beginning to put at the center of the table new forms of relationality. Now, when Marx is raising this question, is coming from the practice. This is much more difficult to do than is to say it. But saying it is important, and it remains as a guide in terms of what is said, but also what is visualized in aesthetics and also represented in movements. This morning I was listening to a bomba class in Puerto Rico. It's an Afro-Puerto Rican music, and I was talking with a colleague of mine, Carter Mates, about the resonances of that and the music and rhythms and the spirituality of Mardi Gras Indian community in New Orleans, for example, right? And so all of these pieces also there, we need to continue also building on them, including the relationship with our indigenous sisters and brothers across the globe, which is one of the reasons among many why this conversation is so important.
Great, thank you. This is really, we're going to open it up for conversation, for questions. So we're going to pass it on to Sally, but I just want to put one thing in around violence and nonviolence and peaceful protest and the limitations that are sometimes imposed by the state through laws and deterrence. Both specific deterrence so that you don't do it, and general deterrence so that they make examples out of you. And you saw in the George Floyd moment, that was the first thing they did when people burned cop cars, right? And no one, to my knowledge, the level of support for that, wasn't that widespread, which is something that we should take account for, at least in New York City, when the cop cars got burned. But that changed the trajectory of what we saw as a potential uprising and the limitations of that potential uprising and the changing of the tactics that were deployed and the policing of each other on the streets, which was a very odd thing. But when I look back to Palestine, it happens as well, because you have young kids that want to throw rocks at Israeli army patrols that are passing by. But the person, the Palestinian who owns the store says, don't do it in front of my shop, right? Don't do it in my neighborhood. Don't do it in my city, because of the consequences of that, right? And I think that one of the most important things that at least I remember being brought up with is that the way we fight domination and oppression shouldn't be limited, and we shouldn't try to limit others and how they fight back, because we're not in that same position, though we may all be Palestinian. And in the process of trying to limit our tactics strategically in order to exact wins, that has been where it led us with the Palestinian struggle. We're now at a point in which, oh, there will be a peace process, but you have to stop fighting back in this particular way. Then the peace process results in 10,000 more settlements, more land back, more land taken, and then you're like, well, now what do we do? So they buy time through this mechanism. And ironically, our experience has been, even with the Guggenheim, that was the same experience. They didn't give a shit about the stuff that we were doing here because it's a colonial logic, right? When we were fighting back against them building Guggenheim Abu Dhabi with migrant labor, we took direct action, we took over their walls, we kind of we shut down the museum, and then they said, okay, we'll talk, but you have to stop the direct action. So it's not so much that it's violence and nonviolence, but what are the ways in which we can resist that are unsanctioned, that actually create leverage and level blows? But that's not the main strategy. The main strategy is to find each other and to create transformative spaces, to build these kind of relations. So maybe, I'll just end with like, this point around violence and nonviolence. I have never seen that it's helpful to try to think of it in terms of like convincing others, as you said. I think it's more of like, what are the strategies and tactics that we need to deploy for effective resistance? It's always a question of strategy and tactics. It's never one of morality or one of modernity or one of civilized or one of whatever. Okay, Sally, back to you.
Okay, I'm just going to hop right in here with the first question. It's from Frank Schofield to all of the panelists, but it's first directed towards Jess Kira. How do you define or do good political education that cultivates and inspires political movements?
I think others should jump in. I think this is a big question. But one of the things I've been thinking about is how we learn from the histories of past struggles, and how, in order for us to be able to think through the creation of a set of political goals that are agreed upon by multiple communities, that have a kind of integrity and are informed by a commitment and a responsibility, I feel like we have to do some work to understand our own histories and our own ways of coming into being, and our own sense of epistemology and how we understand the world and the frameworks that we use to draw from. And I have been, thinking about what it means to do this kind of work within the university to some regard, because that's where I'm located and spend some of my time teaching, but more recently outside of the university. Not that there's, not that there isn't a permeable boundary between the two, but in spaces where people are interested in sharing their histories and joining conversations in ways that may seem unlikely at the start. So instead of a predetermined list of people that we know are experts that have experiential knowledge about these things that can speak to these ideas, to pull people together in neighborhoods and in communities that already carry knowledge and experiences. They're just not identified as or labeled or categorized as the people that can speak to these things necessarily. And so I think to be less predetermined about the kinds of conversations and the kinds of assemblages of people that come together in some form. And I've been really thinking back to some of the work of anti-colonial feminists that I've learned from over the years, who I actually sharpened my teeth on political organizing with when I was 18 years old and first moved to Saskatoon on the prairies. And it was actually a coalition of Native women, of immigrant women, of women that were West African migrants that had come to the city. And they were working together in coalition, trying to do this work of figuring out how to develop a shared political agenda in a city that has a long history of, colonial violence against Indigenous people, is incredibly segregated and divided, has strong assimilation tactics for migrants and immigrants arriving. And so I'm starting now to think about all those things that I learned when I first began sort of educating myself about political work and what it means to do solidarity work. And I'm actually finding that to be a really refreshing return. And I think social media, I will also say this, I'm really not a social media person, but I also feel like the kind of the sort of trafficking of personality and celebrity on social media has created an entirely new set of issues for us to deal with within social movement work. Not that there's not strategic ways to draw on social media to be able to advance a political cause, but it's also created an entire way of relating that I feel like in many ways undermines our ability to understand one another in a real way.
Can I just build on some of those comments, just Kieran, because I think what I hear you saying, and others too, is the absolute importance of face-to-face work in the flesh organizing. And I think obviously over the duration of the pandemic, we've gotten very deprived, to say the least, of that kind of experience, and also nostalgic for it. But so when I hear political education, I think about public education, and I think about the social media landscape and the information landscape in general. We just turn on our devices and we are completely inundated by political education. It may not be the kind of political education that that speaks to our political positions, but we're inundated by it. And I think all the more reason why direct action and in the flesh organizing becomes all the more important. That's why the pipeline struggles and Land Back Lane and Standing Rock and others really stand out, because it's those moments when people put their bodies on the line and take position on the land that crystallizes the attention in a way I think that nothing on the information or social media landscape does these days. People are increasingly they want to block out most of what's coming towards them, but you can't ignore the direct action, and so I think it's a false dichotomy, obviously, between political education and direct action, because direct action is a form of political education. But I really appreciate the attention everyone's given to struggles actually on the ground, which involve face-to-face work.
Maybe I'll just echo what Jess Gearin was talking about around the need to really focus on history. I think that's really important, that we understand our own histories and then the histories of the people that we're working with. But I think it comes down to one of the, what was one of the central sort of ideas that helped form around Decolonize This Place, is to really start with like who we are as a collective. When we talk about the community, like who are we talking about? Who's here? Or who should be here if they're not here? And then what do we need to know about each other in order to be working together in the most effective way? I think that's one of the things that during sort of pandemic times we can do some of the work there, is to dig into those histories and try and figure out what it is we need to know about each other in order to move forward most effectively, and what are the histories of struggle that we can build on as we move forward. I think there's another piece of political education. We separate the political from the practical, but I think it's worth asking what it is, what are we learning for? What's the purpose of acquiring knowledge around the political? And I think that there's all sorts of forms of learning that we need to do in order to inhabit the world in a better way, and to build capacity and skill in our own movements and lives in order to get there. So I think about, there's definitely a need for more reading and history and oral history and learning about other people's struggles and our own struggles. There's also a need for building like practical skills that lead us to where we want to go. We want the land back. Can we live on the land? Can we start a fire? Can we hunt? Can we gather the things? Can we cook for each other? There's all sorts of sort of practical skill building that I think are part of the work of political education. And it's about inviting people into spaces where you can do that kind of capacity building collectively so that we're actually able to focus on some of the other direct action, all the other work. When we're sort of in the work of survival, it can feel really hard to kind of jump back and learn the histories and do the reading and that kind of thing. So I think we need to bring those things together and not think of them as separate. That it should be the people who we're cooking with and living with, and that the work of living together is part of the theoretical work we're doing also.
I mean, I think that's the idea around the difference between just the idea to just survive or to thrive as communities, right? And I mean, like we can say over and over and over again that, we've been dispossessed of our lands, we've been oppressed by, we've been over incarcerated by, but if there isn't people that are willing to do the on the ground work that we're doing, like it really needs, there needs to be some catalyst for those conversations to start happening. And if we're not, making those spaces like this one, even, it being virtual and what have you, but I mean, to be able to, I know for myself, going to Ipperwash as a very, very young teenager after Dudley George was shot, being shown what that means for, like, that's the education for me that was very important to give to my kids as they grew up, we took over a police station when my kids were quite young, and, we occupied that for several months. And like, this is work that is ongoing that needs to keep on, like that education piece around, I really can't stress that enough, but and I know for academic folks that's in the schools and universities and colleges, but for folks like myself, like that education starts at home. And that's, having those conversations with our parents, with our uncles, our aunties, or, the cousins that, that we can, push them to have those conversations that are hard, because like, the trauma that comes with doing the on the ground work, like we Indigenous people in this country have had a hard go, and there's lots and lots of people who have, had to sit through jail. Like the last time in 2006 after Maldonado happened, like, that was a year of my life in a tent in a bush, and then 7 months in jail. Like 4 months of that was sitting in segregation in the hole. So I mean, like, this is something that for folks that, are willing to put your ass on the line to push the movement forward. Like it does take that education, but at the same time, like, it's supporting the folks that are doing the heavy lifting, like the folks that come in here with us, almost 8 months ago now. Like, I really got to take my hat off to the fact that they're still here, and like some of the ally folks that I know that have, came in here with us on day one and still continue to support, and all the amazing ways that they do. Like, I can't say enough about how grateful I am to those people that, are willing to do and be all of the ways and make it to make this happen. Because like, there's no 1, 2, 3, 10 people that can make this happen. Like, this is, it needs to be community driven. And if you're able to kind of cultivate those relationships in community, like, that's what it takes to really be able to push these issues to the forefront.
Sally, I just want to point something out, that because we're running over time, some of us may have to leave, and that's okay, but just Kieran's one of them. We should try to field the questions that remain, perhaps bunch them, 3 or 4, that could help kind of encapsulate that. And just Kieran, before you leave, if you have any thoughts you want to share with the group, please do.
Okay, I'm going to ask the question. This one it's sort of specific to arts institutions, but I think it relates to all of the things, all of the threads that were in today's conversation. It's from Harry Burke. It's thank you for this beautiful convening. I'm really appreciating the careful, insightful exchange. I have a question that brings us back to the exhibition space as a site for staging discussions about sovereignty and land struggles. Art galleries tend to reify or privilege a certain kind of engagement with representation. It seems that each of you as artists and organizers are nurturing relational solidarities that extend beyond the representational field or pictorial plane. Is there a relation here to the demand that cultural institutions do more than iterate this significant yet arguably sometimes symbolic gesture of land acknowledgement and to materially engage with land back movements? Might there be an important unresolved tension between representational and reciprocal strategies within decolonial aesthetics? And is this something that you found ways to work through in your own art making and community building?
Just Kiran, why don't you go ahead first, because you need to leave. So do you want to say anything?
Oh, I think there are others that are much better suited to answer that question than I. So please go ahead. I can stay for a few more minutes. I'll write in the chat when I'm ready to leave. Sorry,
Okay.
sorry I have to run, everyone.
No worries. Well, first of all, shout out to Harry before anything else. And Nelson, do you want to say something, or Anne, before we because there's deep TP, we can ramble on for 2 hours about this specific question.
It would be good to hear from others. Yeah,
exactly.
We're all about that. This relates specifically to the problem we're facing. And I would say this, like, if you look at Palestinians right now, they're just doing drawings and paintings because they want to sell it in Dubai, right? Because that's what ends up happening, right? So the market dictates that. And I think that we saw this in the context of the Whitney organizing, for example. Even though we didn't call for people to boycott, we didn't call for people, we said, resist in all the ways you deem appropriate based on your diverse, different positionalities that you hold. But I think that there's the role of the artist and the role of the curator and the role of the institution right now. We want to hear how these things, need to push.
And just to add a little bit to it, I think what ends up happening is that because of just how, of course, the media works through these, struggles and how it represents, because a lot of the conversation, once again, is happening through social media or media in general. What you end up seeing is false dichotomies, like false binaries that get constructed, right? In this case being like, as if, the abolition of the institution, or the kind of moving beyond this pictorial representational plane and really addressing the structural cost is at the cost of having that representational thing that the system's running on its own right now within the diversity, equity, inclusion system, right? So then you're basically, once again, pitted against this false binary that exists. And so, yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Can I say, there's a phrase that has appeared in New York on banners and actions and around different struggles, which is, public land equals stolen land. And, the kind of the historical reframing that does, I wonder what that means for how we think about universities and art galleries that are, public, and just sort of what that, and what the imperative of land back could mean for those kinds of institutions. And I know it depends on, very specific contexts and circumstances in different places, but, just in the way in which both the university and the art gallery also oftentimes, or as Harry was saying, places that talk a lot about principles of solidarity and justice. But what does the material enactment of that, what could that actually involve at different kinds of institutions? That is I just wanted to kind of echo that kind of kernel of what Harry was posing, you know.
And if I may very quickly, just to add one more layer to that you're all aware, but you know, you have, how do these institutions relate to the land back movements? But the other question is, how do they relate to repatriation movements? I mean, one thing is, how can they actually ask for giving the land back, but not giving the artworks and stolen artifacts back? Of course, that would be contradiction, but that would be another. And maybe they would be afraid of speaking about having the land back because they know that they cannot get away of saying that without also saying, giving the art and giving what they took back from the lands back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, this is a sticking point, and I'll crystallize it, and I'll say it with a lot of love and care. But when you're forced into these kind of colonial conditions and generations pass, then seeing yourself on a wall of a place that's precious becomes affirming to a humanity that's been under attack for so long. No one wants to diminish that, but it's a cycle that we're facing, because then you have to talk with the people that you want to be in solidarity with. And you have to say, look, if we keep agreeing to doing this, they're using some of us as shields for a broader attack on them, or the dismantling of them to produce other sites that can allow for other ways of resistance. So how, you know, it's a situation in New York City in particular, because the people that got fired, the more money now is going to come after the pandemic, more money is going to come from more fucked up people that are going to determine the nature of the aesthetics. And they're going to give some people more diversity and equity and inclusion, but what they're going to do in the process, what they're going to do is kind of shield themselves from a broader moment in which land must be returned, shit must be repatriated, control of their place, right? And the inclusion of one curator, two curators, three curators with a broad kind of framework around abolition and decolonization and what have you, still remains within the confines of it being framed by people with a lot of fucking money that imprison, incarcerate, kill, sell, extract. So this contradiction that we're facing right now is part of how it relates to aesthetics in our institutions. And it's a hard conversation to have because no one wants to diminish the struggles that have come before that have led to issues to being more represented, more included. But if I'm a person who's also seeing the struggle from a Palestinian standpoint, I don't want to be included in this fucked up system. And I'm not going to celebrate more inclusion into a fucked up system. But I also know why that's not just a choice for me, it's a choice for others. This is the conversation, this is the moment in New York where it's coming to a head. And I think that it's, whether it's the indigenous struggle or whether it's Black liberation and abolition, whether it's anti-imperialism.
Or gender or queerness, or,
you know, Epstein at MoMA relationship, you know, it's endless. So what do we do there? And how can a gallery like Guelph, for example, support the land back lane movement there in a material way that is building on the acknowledgement that just came at the beginning of this conversation?
Well, I mean, I think that doing this, you know, like, and I think that's the capacity to be able for, a university of museums, for those curators to be able to allow for space for these conversations to exist, to be able to not only make them something that can happen, but encourage them to happen for those conversations that I was talking about that need to start at home, that bringing those people in that aren't just the academics of the world, that aren't just the people with letters behind their name, but people that have done the work. Because I think this is an important distinction, is certainly in Indigenous communities anyways, is that not, none of the teachers that I've had have ever had a series of letters behind their name. The people that have taught me about the land and taught me about my connection to it. Like these are the elders of our community, people that, sat with their grandmothers and their grandmothers before them to be able to teach us what it takes to do this kind of work. And I think that bit around, and I'm not saying that by any means trying to harp on the academic folks of the world to say that, that you guys shouldn't do this or that or whatever, that work is important as well. But to understand that, like, that bit of privilege that not very many, certainly from our community anyway, are able to access because of the, several centuries of trauma and hardship and, dispossession that we've all accumulated over those hundreds of years. And so I think that it alienates a lot of people when we don't try and engage those people that might not understand what it means to be in this room we're in. And so I think that alienating people is something that we really need to work on, to be able to bring people into the fold, to make sure that people are understanding exactly what it is that's going on. And the language that we use, I think, is very important when we do that work. Because if we're going to, make these academic conversations ones that are inaccessible to the people that could actually do the work, that are willing to put their asses on the line to make sure that their kids and their grandkids, because this isn't about, what I'm going to write my thesis paper on. This is about making sure that my grandkids at least have an argument that this land is theirs when it comes time for them to make this same stand.
Mm-hmm.
I really, really agree with that, that these are spaces that need to function for people who've been historically excluded from them, but that inclusion itself is not enough. I'm reading a new book from Catherine McKittrick, and there's a chapter in the book's called Dear Science. She's a Black geographer, feminist geographer. I think that there's a piece of that really resonated with me, just talking about, she repeats it over and over again, how description is not liberation. And I think the same thing goes when we're talking about aesthetic practice, when we're talking about representation, that a lot of that can happen without liberation even being part of the goal. It's just about getting out there and getting the word out and getting these images out in the public sphere, and that doesn't do what we want it to do. So I think if we think about art as practice and as method, then we can open up a discussion about what it's for, what it's leading towards, and are we engaging with aesthetic practices in ways that are leading towards liberation? I think there are ways to mobilize in that direction, but I want to skip a lot of the discussion with art institutions and curators, and if they can't figure out a way to work for us, then I'm kind of like, well, fuck it. Like I don't want to. There's like this tortured thing that happens about like representation and conservation, and we don't even get to the point talking about like repatriation, because it's like, well, there's all this complexity in how we hold on to culture. And I think, I've written about this a little bit. I want to like go past it and imagine ourselves at the future point where we're free, and how have we gotten to that point? I talk about that as like a speculative Indigenous retrospective. Like we're looking back at what we've abolished. How did we get to that point? And then for the folks who are in areas where they're doing curating or they're working with artists, you know, how do we get to that point together? What can you offer? I think offering space is like a really good start. We need space. You know, we need land. We need places to gather. We need people who are willing to work with us in ways that don't put us into boxes. I think this is part of what I've struggled with a lot in working with arts organizations, is that, you know, I can speak as an activist, or I can speak as an artist, or I can speak as an academic. And those things are harder for people to deal with when they're all one thing. And what I really want to do is to work as a land defender and to be in better relation with people. And it's the relations with people that is the most important. And that's what motivates my work. That's the method, is the relation building. And I think that that's the work that's work that arts institutions can pick up. What's your relation to the people whose land you're occupying, and how can you sort of orient yourself towards strengthening that relationship, and that might mean shifting parts of the structure and the way that you're organizing, and it might mean looking at the economic structures and funding, and it might mean looking beyond representation. Maybe there's spaces you can offer that don't even aren't facing towards a kind of settler public. And you know, that can be powerful too. You know, I think that a lot of that, when I think about my own artistic practice, it's basically impossible for me to do art if I think about doing it for white people. And if I think about it in a different way, then I think about like how this brings us into different kinds of conversations and different relations, and my relationships with other people. I think that's where I feel like art spaces can actually be like a really liberatory, freeing space, but it requires that reorientation.
Okay, I think we're 1 minute from 2 p.m. So I think we might, I'm looking at your face, Amin.
I think we should wrap up.
We're gonna
People
wrap
have to leave.
Yeah.
And we want to thank Skylar and Nelson and Anne and Jaskiran so much. This has been a great talk for me, just in terms of thinking through some of these questions with you. Send a link, Nit, for the follow-up. Thank you so much, Sally.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, everybody, for this. And I just wanted to say one thing. I feel like land back is so many things, as you mentioned, and I feel like it's often so unsettling for people to even think about what it would mean concretely. So thank you for that. That's it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you to all of the panelists and to everyone who spoke today, and for everyone who was on the call today. Or the conversation rather. We're going to be hosting the next iteration on March 27th. Again, it will begin at noon. So please log on to the Art Gallery of Guelph website, or follow Decolonize This Place on their social media, on their website, or on their Instagram, to just be in the loop of when the next conversation will take place again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
You too. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.